Hello, everyone. We are going to wait just a few more minutes as I see participants trickling in. So please hold on for just another minute or two, and then we will begin this webinar. Thank you. All right, it looks like we have quite a few people who have now joined. Definitely critical mass, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off here. I'll start by welcome everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. Welcome to this webinar from the Accountability Framework Initiative on the topic of protecting land rights in commodity supply chains, held in collaboration with AFI coalition members, Forest Peoples Program, and Proforest. I'm Karen Steer, staff at Rainforest Alliance, which co-hosts the Secretariat of the Accountability Framework Initiative, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This is the latest in a series of AFI training and learning webinars, each of which addresses specific topics aimed at supporting companies in achieving responsible commodity supply chains and following the accountability framework's 12 core principles, definitions, and practical guidance for setting, implementing, and reporting on commitments to no deforestation, no conversion, and full respect for human rights. Turning to today's topic, commodity supply chains are coming under Am I back? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, you're back. Just
All
about
right.
to do that.
Okay, well, I have no idea where I was last, so I apologize, but I love the internet. I will keep moving us along. Um, so, um, so we put this webinar together to help understand what it means to respect Indigenous peoples and local community rights from the context of downstream companies. And I will quickly present the speakers that we have lined up today from the AFI Coalition as well as other partners. We're going to start with Savita Patriana, the programs coordinator for the Foundation of Sustainable Forest Peoples in Indonesia, who will share some experiences working on the ground level and talk about why it's important for downstream companies to play an active role in human rights due diligence. We'll then hear from Anushka Param, coordinator and senior counsel at Forest Peoples Program, who'll provide a brief overview of what the accountability framework has to say about the topic and share her perspectives on company commitments to respect land rights. And then finally, we'll have a tag team presentation from Proforest's Justin Dupre Harbord and Landessa's Megan Olson, who will offer up practical guidance for addressing land rights in commodity supply chains and also share perspectives from some companies they've directly supported in this process. We'll then shift over to participant Q&A, and we've reserved about 25 minutes for our expert panelists to answer your questions. So on that, just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, we've disabled the chat function, and we encourage you to use the Q&A function throughout the presentations to submit your questions. You'll have the option of posing questions anonymously if you prefer, and questions will be answered live during the Q&A session, or some of them might also be answered in writing as they are received. This webinar is also being recorded. It will be on the AFI website in a few days and will also be sent directly to the inbox to all people who registered for the webinar. So with that, I would like to get started, and I will hand the stage over to Savita.
Thanks, Karen, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Savita, and my organization is a national NGO in Indonesia working with Indigenous communities to secure their rights. And I'm going to start my part with a brief background about what the situation is like for Indigenous communities in Indonesia. So Indonesia is home to an estimated 50 to 70 million Indigenous peoples. And most Indigenous communities hold land under customary tenure systems and lack formal titles, making them especially vulnerable to land grabbing. At the same time, the process for Indigenous communities to secure formal land rights can be 15 years or more, while wealthy and politically connected companies can secure palm oil concessions within 3 to 5 years by taking advantage of legal loopholes and often by working in collusion with corrupt officials. And as a result, many Indigenous communities find themselves in the middle of land conflicts when their customary lands, where they have relied upon for generations, are taken without their consent. And for them, whose life and livelihoods depends on the land and forest, losing land can mean losing lives. So they don't stay idly. They resist and fight back violations of their rights to customary land. But when they do this, they often experience further violations of their right. Now I'm going to show you an excerpt from an interview with an Indigenous community who is trying to reclaim their stolen land. They asked my organization to document their struggle and to share it with you all today. And I'm going to read what one of the women said. I was working in the field when the police officer fired his shot. Because of the shock, my daughter fell ill. My daughter was only 8 back then, and she has been very traumatized ever since that she doesn't want to go to the field again. So this women's field is actually located in the disputed land. And this is just an example on how violent land conflict could be and how it often leads to other rights violations. And we also have to remember that there is also a gender dimension to conflict which shows that women, children, and the elderly are often the most vulnerable. And my last slide is just a summary really of what other examples where the rights are violated, which include first, land expropriation and violations of customary and community tenure and resource rights. And the second, the example I was just talking before, is the use of violence, intimidation, and threats. And the third one is criminalizations, specifically targeting community leaders, customary landowners, human rights and environmental defenders. And these are frequently done in association with the police and military, and sometimes with the backing of local judicial system. And we are also seeing violations of the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And next on the list is the violations of the right to freedom of association. As an example, when communities, they hold peaceful protests or demonstrations to ask for the return of their stolen land, they face police violence or violence attack by company security guards. And we also see violations of their rights to food security, clean water, a healthy environment, cultural heritage, and cultural integrity. And last on this list, but not exhaustive, these are denial of other rights, for example, the right to justice, the right to decent work, and often the right to remedy. And I'm going to end my part here with the belief that everyone joining today agrees that it is scandalous to turn a blind eye to these kind of human rights violations against Indigenous peoples, and that we should work together to prevent and to stop them from happening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Savita. That's beautiful. I'd like to now turn to Anushka.
Thanks very much, Karen. I'm going to talk through some of the legal aspects of land rights and Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights, starting with the AFI principles themselves. Could we go to the next slide, please? So the accountability framework sets out 12 core principles, which basically set up standard setting, the implementation and the reporting of companies on their commitments. Respect for human rights is principle 2, but I'm going to read through all 12. So number 1 is protection of natural ecosystems. Number 2 is respect for human rights, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. 3 is scope and time frame. And then 4 is around the company systems to drive implementation. And then the next few are really related to different areas of implementation. So supply chain management, assessment and traceability, and managing for compliance, responsible production, which is land acquisition and land use planning, land management, protection, restoration, and access to remedy, then landscape and sectoral collaboration, and then finally monitoring and verification, reporting, disclosure, and claims. So that's sort of from the, I guess, cradle to grave of a framework for companies to address environmental and human rights issues connected to their value chains. So what does the AFI offer in terms as a framework? So I think principally it follows existing recognised due diligence frameworks, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD, and provides detailed practical guidance. It integrates environment and human rights, and it's backed by a broad consensus from organisations that have put it together and other companies that have been involved with it. It operates with existing systems and has a harmonised approach to bring those together. It's applicable universally to different types of commodities and in different countries, and it's very attuned to the value chain. Could I go on to the next slide? And I'm just going to quickly touch on core principle 2.2, which is specifically one of the ones focusing on Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights, just to dig in a little bit into the detail. So this is effectively indicating that companies commit to respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities in all their production and trade, including business activities carried out consistent with UNDRIP, due diligence to avoid adverse impacts to human rights and to prevent and mitigate harms, effective grievance mechanisms and remedy, and free, prior and informed consent secured prior to any activity. The that is broadly the framework that is under the UNGPs, and I'm going to use the UN Guiding Principles as the framework for what I discuss further in the next minutes of this presentation. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the sources of international human rights law for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is not an exhaustive list. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I just wanted to list some of the many sources where Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights are protected, just to indicate that it's not any one treaty or any one document, but rather it's been developed cumulatively over time by a wide range of international human rights bodies, and that you can't find out what your obligations are by reading any one document, also because it changes over time and it evolves over time. But there are many different dimensions to protection of Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights that are really well grounded across a wide range of international human rights law. Next slide, please. So what I instead kind of want to focus on is, what does that mean when it comes to companies, and where do the company responsibilities lie, particularly for downstream companies? So I think everyone is aware that there's a lot of focus on corporate due diligence as part of the UN Guiding Principles. And I think there is a very significant shift in company behaviour to do more of this kind of due diligence and policy commitment to respect human rights. But I think we've recently published a guide called Stepping Up, which is about protecting collective land rights through corporate due diligence. And we really take a step back and look from the UN Guiding Principles and remember that it's not only about processes in place, it's also about outcomes. And that, I think, is something that is really critical for companies to keep in mind. So the UNGPs include a corporate responsibility to respect human rights and the provision of remedy. And these are both areas where it's not just about whether you have process in place, but whether those processes are actually being effective, and you need to be able to show that they are effective in the long term, and that's the case whether you're downstream or upstream. Next slide, please. So some of the key elements for Indigenous peoples and local communities, I would say, are, first of all, that they have the right to determine their own development priorities. So companies coming in from the outside, that may not fit with what their own development priorities are. They also have customary rights to land that are not recognised or documented by national law. International human rights law protects these land rights, and it's particularly important that companies acting internationally or indeed nationally look to international human rights law and not to national law protections, which may be non-existent or substantially lesser in determining what they need to do. Indigenous people's right to land includes the right to restitution of land, which is something that is very complex to deal with, but very important to bear in mind. So it's not simply a question of once people have been dispossessed, it's just a question of monetary compensation or nothing. There is also a question of land restitution. Effective participation, which includes consultation, participatory impact assessment, negotiations of benefits, as well as free, prior and informed consent, are really central tenets of appropriate engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And finally, another complex issue is who you're engaging with, where you're engaging with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Oftentimes, states will set up their own systems that may not really reflect who is the genuine leadership of Indigenous peoples and local communities. In fact, it's important that you're engaging with Indigenous people's self-chosen representatives and that they are accountable and legitimate in the eyes of the community. Next slide, please. So taking this back to where we get to with due diligence, and what does it mean to have an outcome requirement and not simply a process in place? Well, I think what that means is that we have to view the process in a dynamic environment. So what is acceptable as a step in one time is not necessarily acceptable 2 years later when you see it hasn't worked or where it hasn't been effective enough. So there are two things that I would say are critical in this. First of all, you may need to make more and wider, including systemic changes in the medium to longer term. And secondly, that whilst prioritization is okay in the short term, over time, it's expected that companies have increased scope, depth and coverage of their value chains. So that means that you may start with areas that are the highest risk or where you have the most leverage, but eventually you'll need to cover everything. Basically, I think where we get to on this, the responsibilities are only met if there's continuous improvement, human rights impacts, including of activities that are only directly linked, so not caused or contributed to, need to be effectively addressed within a reasonable time. And what starts off as directly linked may become a cause or a contribution if it's not addressed within a reasonable time. So I think that's sort of our perspective on it, that it's really important that companies are not only looking at processes, but also at outcomes, and that they're focusing on what Indigenous peoples themselves are asking for. My final slide is on remedy, and then I'll finish up. So I think there's a lot of movement in remedy in international spaces at the moment, including for development finance institutions. And one of the principles that's coming out is that remedy should be built in as a cost of doing business. So it's not, I don't think, right to think of remedy in strictly legal terms in the sense of the UNGPs. If your company is profiting from a harm to someone else, even if that's from very far, it's fair that you give something back, and people will expect that you should give something back as a remedy. The remedy for Indigenous peoples and local communities in particular, it's really important there's consultation on what that remedy should look like and what the appropriate steps are. If communities want you to cease your engagement, you should really be seriously considering that. Sometimes, in fact, in many cases, communities will ask for engagement. And finally, I will just add that for Indigenous peoples and local communities in particular, money is often not an adequate remedy. Loss of land is a really, really destructive thing for Indigenous peoples and local communities. It's often the loss of their culture, the loss of their self-determination, the loss of their existence as a community. So that might mean you can never adequately mitigate with money alone. And that really is something that needs to be taken into account in what steps are taken by companies. I'm going to stop there because I'm probably already over time, but I'm happy to take questions later. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Anushka. And now we will turn it over to Justin and Megan.
Thanks, Karen. And please let me know if you can hear me and if I cut out. So yeah, at Proforest, we work directly with companies both downstream and upstream at the production level to support them in implementing their sustainability commitments across both environmental and human rights issues. And so building on some of the points and steps outlined by Anushka, I'll share a bit more about how at Proforest we've started working with companies on respecting Indigenous peoples and local communities, land rights, and really putting some of these steps into practice. And I'll be sharing these insights along with Megan Olson, who's also on the call from Landesa, as Landesa and Proforest over the last few years have been increasingly working together on supporting companies on their respective land rights and Indigenous peoples and local community rights. And we'll specifically be pulling out some examples from our work this year with Nestlé, where we've been supporting them in developing their Indigenous peoples and local communities land rights action plan. So yeah, next slide, thanks. So yeah, building a bit on what Anushka already presented around the UNGPs, at Proforest, we also use the UNGP approach when we're working with companies and recommending on what steps they need to take to respect human rights more broadly, but also the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And if I start here with step one is about setting a policy commitment. So a company needs to have a commitment to respecting human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities and their land rights. And also this would usually include also their right to free, prior, informed consent. And this would usually come under the form of a responsible sourcing policy in a given commodity or a wider human rights policy. But some companies may also be having a specific land rights policy as well. Then we move on to human rights due diligence and the steps under human rights due diligence, which start with step one of identify actual and potential human rights impacts to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is also important to identify those potential and actual impacts across the whole business. So in the company's own operations, any other business ventures that they have, and also within their whole supply chains across the different commodities that they source. Then we move to step two, where based on those findings, they actually need to act upon those findings and take action. And this is about taking action, first of all, to address and remediate issues that have been identified through step one, but also support and put in place practices that in the long term will hopefully kind of prevent future abuses of land rights or Indigenous peoples and local community rights happening in the future. And a key part of this step is also that these actions should be embedded into the company's existing processes and teams. And then step 3, obviously a key part here, building on what Anushka said around outcomes, is that the company needs to be tracking that the actions that they're taking are actually effective are actually working and effective in improving the respect of land rights and indigenous peoples and local communities. And based on that tracking, they may need to make changes to the actions that they're taking over time. And then step 4, obviously the company needs to be communicating around this whole process and the actions that are taking, and communicating around their progress. And this communication needs to be available to all stakeholders, including specifically the affected indigenous peoples and local communities. And then finally, the company also needs to have in place, if we're looking through the UNGP lens again, needs to have in place a process to enable remediation. Really address, again, cases of land rights abuse and abuse of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And this will usually come under the form of a grievance mechanism. And especially, I should actually maybe just pause for 1 second and say that in this presentation, I'll be talking a lot about downstream companies and the context there, because we've been working a lot with them. And in some ways, it may be a bit more challenging what actions they need to be taking. And so when I'm talking about downstream companies, I'm talking about companies that are far removed from the production level. So there's multiple suppliers between them and the actual producer where the commodity is being produced. So as I was saying, in terms of remediation, this will usually come under the form of a company having a grievance mechanism in place. And many downstream companies will usually have multiple grievance mechanisms depending on the area of the business that they're looking at, because the types of actions and responsibility will vary depending if the grievance is against their own operations directly or linked to them through their supply chain, although there's still some discussion around what is their responsibility in those cases as well, but they will usually have separate grievance mechanisms to tackle those different parts. And finally on this last slide, on the previous slide, a few key things to keep in mind in the context of a downstream company is that, as I said, downstream companies rarely actually have operations at production level. And so they're sourcing through multiple different suppliers and are far removed. And when we're looking at impacts and abuses of indigenous peoples and local community rights and their land rights, obviously a lot of these abuses happen at the production level. So although these downstream companies need to be implementing this UNGP and human rights due diligence approach across their whole business, when we're talking about a downstream company specifically working on indigenous peoples and local community rights issues, a lot of their actions are going to be about influencing what is happening upstream, what is happening at that production level. And linked to this, a key challenge around that is that those companies, to be able to do that, need to have a relatively good level of traceability information on where the volumes they're buying of a certain commodity are actually being produced. And that remains a challenge in quite a lot of commodity supply chains where these downstream companies still don't have much visibility on where the commodity they're buying is being produced. So we can move to the next slide. Oh yeah, so now I'm going to pass on to Megan, who's going to bring what I've just presented a bit more to life and share kind of practical actions for step 1 of the human rights due diligence process on identifying potential and actual risk to indigenous peoples and local communities.
Thanks, Justin. So really briefly, Landesa is a global nonprofit organization that focuses on strengthening the land rights of rural communities globally. And as Justin mentioned, over the past several years, we have partnered with Proforest on a number of projects to support companies on respecting and strengthening land rights in their operations and supply chains, to include the land rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So as Justin noted in today's presentation, we will focus on some elements within the assess and address components, starting with this slide on practical approaches for assessing indigenous people and local community land rights risks when you're considering a company with a sourcing footprint spanning numerous countries and commodities. And Justin noted that in today's presentation, we will draw from a current example of work we are supporting Nestle on to develop a human rights salient issue action plan on indigenous peoples and local community land rights. So as Brief background on this work, Nestle has identified 10 human rights salient issues, one of which is Indigenous people and local community land rights as part of its new human rights framework and roadmap. And so an action plan is being developed and published over the course of this year, 2022, for each of these salient issues. And these action plans aim to set a cross-commodity strategy for how Nestle will assess, address, monitor, and report on this issue over the next 3 years following the HRDD framework that Justin just presented in the prior slide. And for the Indigenous peoples and local community land rights action plan specifically, it's anticipated to be published in August of this year. And then just to note that all of the action plans will be living documents, continue to be updated as Nestle learns and refines the approach and continues to gain more information about their exposure to risk. So as part of developing the action plan, we've worked with Nestle to identify the data that they currently have available to start informing their initial actions and their priority areas, as well as additional data that they should start collecting in the future in order to improve their understanding of their exposure to risk in terms of parts of the business where there's potential or actual adverse human rights impacts occurring, understanding specific geographies at risk, specific stakeholders at risk, the severity of risk, and root causes of risk. So in terms of priority areas of the business for Nestle for IPLC land right impacts, we've identified elements of Nestle's owned operations, such as their real estate acquisitions or site expansions, as well as their waters business, as well as their supply chain activities. So looking at their agricultural and forest raw material sourcing, also looking at some of their programs around carbon offsetting and insetting initiatives, as well as their procurement of renewable energy alongside some of their climate net zero commitments. Then to understand priority countries and commodities, Nestle started with a global risk assessment data across all 100 countries from which they source raw materials, giving them a broad overview of Indigenous people and local communities' land rights risk per country. And so that is the first bullet here on this slide that you're seeing, which is the global risk assessment. And that particular data set used national level proxies for land, property, and housing rights and Indigenous peoples' rights, which we all recognize is a starting point, but is quite imperfect and can't speak to, for instance, subnational locations at risk, specific stakeholders and rights holders at risk, or root causes of risk. So there's really a need to supplement with additional information, and how we've conceptualized those additional information streams are the categories listed on this slide. So in addition to that global level overview of high-risk countries, what we're recommending is additional data lenses could include commodity-specific or business activity-specific risk information, looking at that country-specific risk information, as well as supplier-specific risk information. Within each of these data sets, you can collect information from a range of sources, such as geography or business activity-specific assessment, stakeholder consultations, grievances, information from your landscape projects or any sort of site-specific work you're doing with your suppliers, as well as from suppliers' own assessments. So given the information Nestle has currently available, they have complemented data from their global risk assessment with data from their grievance management system, which only covers a few commodities currently, as well as consultation with stakeholders and initial commodity-specific assessments for some commodities. And from this data, they're developing a list of prioritized countries and commodities based on risk to people and volumes to already start taking action. And just to note, while Nestle will start taking action on a list of prioritized countries and commodities, they will work to continue to improve the risk information available to them. For instance, by improving their grievance management process, investing in subnational land rights assessments, supporting community-led monitoring approaches, and engaging in increased stakeholder consultations at national and subnational levels to gain better data to cover these lenses more thoroughly. So as one specific example of that type of work, Nestle is currently working with our teams at Landesa and Proforest to pilot an approach to subnational land rights assessments in 18 subnational regions, directly with local experts from those regions, to develop land rights and resource rights risk profiles. And so while the results of the pilot of this profiling tool is not yet available, it does provide an example of a work to inform a continually improved understanding of risk, which is really one of the key points here, that it's about reviewing and building on existing data, using data that you have now to start taking action while continuing to work to improve your understanding of risk over time. So I'll go ahead and pass the presentation back over to Justin for a discussion on taking action then.
Great, thanks, Megan. Yeah, so now if we move on to what downstream companies should be doing in terms of actually taking action on respecting Indigenous peoples and local community land rights. At Proforest, we very much see that downstream companies need to be working both within their supply chains. So that means taking action directly through their procurement practices and commercial relationships, but also beyond their supply chains, so meaning supporting and investing in kind of initiatives directly on the ground at production and supporting processes to tackle root causes of IPLC land rights abuses. So this may not be directly linked to their supply chain, or it may indirectly be linked to their supply chain because it's coming through the volumes to them. But we think it is very important for companies to actually be supporting projects on the ground, which are providing direct support to those groups as well as collaborating with peers and other stakeholders in wider sector discussions, where we know, for example, in the palm oil sector, we know that the production of palm oil is linked to Indigenous peoples and local community rights abuses. So many companies in that sector now are collaborating around groups such as the Palm Oil Collaboration Group, and Nestle is one of them, where they are working on common approaches, common tools to address the risks to Indigenous peoples and local community rights. So if we move to the next slide. And so starting within the supply chain, a key action here for all companies and downstream companies especially is to engage their suppliers on respecting Indigenous peoples and local community land rights. And this basically means that these companies need to have clear expectations and requirements for both new and existing suppliers on what they expect those suppliers to have in terms of commitments around respecting Indigenous peoples and local community land rights, and what they need to be doing in terms of meeting those commitments. And then following that, the company then needs to be assessing their suppliers in their performance of how they're meeting those requirements, as well as assessing their supplier's risks. So if their supplier is linked to grievances around land rights, or either directly against the supplier's own operations or through the supplier's supply chain, or again, if the supplier is linked to potential areas where we know for a fact that it's very high risk for land rights abuses as well. So the downstream company does need to be assessing their suppliers on those factors. And then based on that information, and the crucial piece of this action is then actually engaging those suppliers and supporting them in improving their practices over time. And a challenge here is that for downstream companies, they can be sourcing from an incredibly high number of different suppliers, especially if we look across commodity. This can go into the hundreds or thousands of suppliers. So many of those downstream companies will start by prioritizing key suppliers for engagement, usually looking at those suppliers who are lower performance in terms of respecting land rights, or who are linked to higher levels of risk. But as Anushka said as well, that doesn't mean that you just ignore those suppliers that you haven't prioritized. It's more about just saying, okay, it is feasible because there's so many suppliers that you would start with a prioritized list, and then over time move to your full supply base and all your suppliers. And Nestle are doing this as well in their action plan. So they have actually set a human rights due diligence assurance framework, which they're currently developing and will be rolling out to assess all their tier one suppliers across all commodities on how their suppliers are doing in terms of committing to respecting human rights and ultimately implementing human rights due diligence within their own businesses and supply chain as well. And within that framework, Nestle is also looking at requirements and considerations around the respect of Indigenous peoples and local community rights and their land rights. And this really speaks to the key point, the first key point there, that any kind of actions around Indigenous peoples and local communities around supplier engagement should be integrated into the company's existing supplier engagement systems, especially their procurement systems. A few other, I won't kind of go into too much detail on all the key points there because I think we're a bit tight on time. But some of the other key points there is that those requirements do need to be tailored to the type of supplier and their position in the supply chain. So the expectations of a supplier who is still quite far removed from the production level will be different from a supplier who is actually owns plantations or is very close to the production level and needs to take direct action on the ground, for example, implementing free prior informed consent processes. And also a key point for this supplier engagement to be effective is that the downstream companies or all companies need to be providing incentives for suppliers to comply with those requirements and disincentives for suppliers who are not complying with those requirements around respecting Indigenous peoples and local community rights. And ultimately that does need to come with, kind of the final point where if a supplier is just continuously not engaging and not improving over time, then the company may want to decide to terminate business relationships with that supplier. And now I'll quickly pass on to Megan to cover how a downstream company should be working in terms of beyond the supply chain and supporting initiatives on the ground at production.
Thanks, Justin. So when thinking about production, country, and landscape level initiatives on respecting Indigenous people and local community land rights, I tend to think about projects that have the opportunity to strengthen these rights by addressing the issue systemically, whether that be through engagement at the national or regional government level on a specific policy, regulation, or program, or supporting the landscape or jurisdictional level initiatives, or even smaller scale on the ground projects. And just in the interest of time here, I'm just going to share a few examples that I've seen downstream company engagement on through those supporting of jurisdictional initiatives or other projects. With one or multiple upstream suppliers that support, for instance, building capacity of affected parties to engage in free prior informed consent processes, supporting participatory land use planning, supporting efforts to engage in the official mapping and legal registration of customary land rights, as well as supporting community-based monitoring and reporting in landscapes. And I just want to note that, of course, that the work on landscape and jurisdictional level initiatives is not disjointed from that sort of advocacy with the government. I think oftentimes landscape or other on-the-ground projects can link back and inform government advocacy, helping to provide the case for policies and legislation implementation and/or, depending on the country context, reform. So I will conclude there.
Great, thank you all for the great presentations. I'd like to open it up now to some Q&A. If anyone listening in on this wants to submit some comments or some questions, please do right now. I have one that I will start out with, which is that question submitted, most of the certification schemes for food commodities include land use right as part of their requirements. What is the gap between what the certified companies are able to achieve and expectations of the Indigenous peoples and international bodies? Do I have a volunteer, one of you, to take on that question? Anushka?
I can give it a shot. I think the framing of this question is interesting as a starting point. So there is a gap between what certified bodies do achieve and what expectations of international and Indigenous peoples are. That's definitely clear. Whether that's what sort of certification bodies are able to achieve is perhaps another question. And I think there's a broader question in here about the role of certification and what it's supposed to be doing. Because, the elephant in the room is, and we have been in contact with a company who said, we're trying to buy only certified palm oil, but we just can't get enough because there's not enough certified palm oil. That's leaving aside the fact that certification doesn't work. The elephant in the room is maybe we're using too much palm oil. Maybe the business needs to change to rely on less palm oil. And I think approaching it from that opposite question about what is our business doing that is unsustainable actually is also really important. So maybe certification schemes are a part of the solution, but there's a broader question about you know, whether or not the reason certification schemes aren't able to do more is also because of a demand problem, too high demand problem that's permanently unsustainable. I think it's really important to reframe the discussion about you know, the demand side issues as well as the supply side ones.
Thank you.
I'd also be happy to add a little bit more to that response, because I also agree that there are clear gaps between what certification schemes are achieving and what we would expect. So I think a few concrete examples of this that I could point to are typically the certification is only going to cover portions of the supply base. So you're not mapping all areas of risk, and typically they're in the if you're talking about something like palm oil, for instance, you're not capturing things outside of the owned plantation. I think another major gap is around the auditor's capacity to evaluate on these topics. I think a big issue is that while the standards, the principles in writing may be strong, they often end up times being a check the box exercise, just looking for a documentation, a document. But really we're talking about trying to assess really complex consultative processes. And those can be, I think, hard really to audit. I think a major another issue is that they oftentimes, these don't actually involve, as part of these audits, consultations with affected community members, the affected right holders. Oftentimes, I think they take place, you know, at the site specifically, and you're not getting the additional, like typically in a land rights assessment, we would be talking to multiple stakeholders, government, the company, but as well as, you know, surrounding smallholders, affected peoples, affected local communities, Indigenous peoples. So I think those are some of the examples that I would point to that are a part of some of the gaps that we're seeing.
Great. So if I'm understanding, then even when a product is certified, there should be the expectation for these downstream companies to be doing additional due diligence within their supply chains and not just to rely on certification alone.
That would be my recommendation, certainly.
Yes, and they should definitely be monitoring for ongoing cases of abuse or grievances, regardless of if that's at a certified plantation or not. And I would also just mention that at least in palm oil, a lot of what companies mean when they're buying certified is on a mass balance basis. So that does not mean actually that 100% of those volumes are coming from just certified plantations. It's actually getting mixed with uncertified volumes as well. So that's why the due diligence is also key for those mass balance volumes, because it doesn't guarantee that 100% of that volume is from certified sources.
Great, thank you. And this touches on another question, which Justin and Megan, you particularly focused your presentations on the use of supplier control mechanisms and really looking at supplier engagement as the way that these downstream companies are able to manage what's going on the ground, because as you said, they are, you know, fairly downstream and removed from what's going on at that supply base level. But are there situations then, in order to do this good due diligence, where it is not enough to rely on that supplier engagement and supplier control, and they do need to be able to have that visibility to what's going on at the ground level, to do monitoring on the ground, to be able to engage not just their suppliers, but their suppliers all the way to the production level, to make sure that, for example, FPIC is done properly, that grievances are being addressed, etc.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can start and Megan can add on. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely true what you're saying. And I think that's also where one of the challenges are. If we consider that a downstream company is already buying from potentially hundreds of tier one direct suppliers, and then if we start going through the supply chain, that number keeps multiplying all the way to production level. So their exposure to the number of producers is massive. So then it becomes a question about, where does the downstream company actually need to focus its efforts in specific countries or jurisdictions? And as we did present, we do recommend that a company takes action through the supplier engagement part and through buying certified volumes as well, but also is identifying areas of high risk or also areas of opportunity where the downstream company can directly get involved in at the ground level, on the ground, and support initiatives to tackle, for example, potentially advocate for better legislation in specific producing countries or in a specific jurisdiction, support Indigenous peoples and local communities directly. So there is definitely, I would say, an expectation there for them to also be looking at on the ground initiatives and supporting those. I think the only challenge there is that currently they're unable to cover the whole production base, so they have to then prioritize and determine where they're going to focus their resources and efforts.
Thank you. And we have a few questions coming in that build off of that and ask if there are any additional or other best practice examples for companies, particularly smaller ones, smaller than the Nestle example, in terms of being able to successfully address human and land rights supply chain risks.
I don't know if Megan, you have any. I would just say, yeah, I mean, I can't kind of list an example off the top of my head. I would say that is a bit more challenging for kind of the smaller companies and medium companies who have less resources to be investing in engaging all of their suppliers, and especially in engaging in landscape initiatives. So again, when a company is determining what actions they need to take, it also needs to be framed into what is feasible within their resources, and also how does it fit in with their current business practices, and is there ways that they can potentially change their business practices to make it easier for them to kind of be respecting Indigenous peoples and local communities, and also potentially build off buyers who are the bigger companies who are potentially buying from them and gaining support from them.
I just have one small point to add to this, and obviously this won't apply for all small companies in all circumstances, but the other opportunity which we see sometimes is smaller companies are more nimble, are able to engage directly with Indigenous producers, smallholders, and have long-term relationships, and really instead of going through companies that are dispossessing Indigenous peoples, be supporting local economies of Indigenous peoples. And I think that's an opportunity that has potential to grow in the future.
I would also share one example. So this is what would be a smaller than Nestle company, but it is a production level company. But Landesa has done a lot of work with the Lobo sugar in Africa around this issue. And I know they've done a lot of work in some of their geographies thinking about their approach on land rights. And so I would point to that as an example of a smaller company, but again, acknowledging that it's a production level company.
Thank you.
I think I can add one more example to what Anushka and Megan has mentioned. So I've seen a successful story from a production level company who was willing to actually engage directly with the community who have a land dispute with them. They engage in a manner that is very consistent, and they commit their time to actually listen to what the community wants of a time. And they have reached an agreement to do some sort of like profit sharing between them to address the harms and risks that they have caused the community. But this requires a lot of resources in terms of time and commitment to actually speak with the right persons in the community.
Thank you. Here's a question as a follow-up to one of the slides that talked about providing incentives and asking if this means a premium price, or are there other examples of what kinds of incentives these downstream companies can be providing?
I mean, I can take first answer. I see Anushka's also potentially. Yeah, I mean, this is still an area realistically that has not been kind of fully developed in terms of what types of incentives, and it also kind of depends on the individual company's procurement practices and how their procurement business is and what they actually kind of have the capacity and resources to do. But that premiums would be one example. Increased volumes. Sometimes it can also just be recognition. Public recognition. I have actually worked with a company where they don't necessarily kind of provide premiums, but they do that public recognition on an annual basis, and that does incentivize their suppliers to be performing better, because then they can publicly communicate about that as well. So there's a whole number of incentives, but I think it's still also an area to be further worked on in the sectors.
Thank you. Then here's a question for when actually grievances are found. If you can elaborate a little bit more on what a downstream company should do if it finds out that one of their suppliers has not obtained FPIC from an Indigenous community and is continuing to produce a commodity on that land. And more broadly, I know that some of you mentioned that there are situations where the downstream company might look at suspending or terminating a commercial relationship with their supplier. Is there additional guidance on what that threshold is? And when there's been clearly a violation or a grievance, what should that downstream company be doing, immediately as well as over the longer term?
I could respond to that. I'm sure Savita has some ideas as well. I think there is no one answer to this, because there's a lot of different circumstances where this can arise. So, in circumstances where there's violence or things like that, or a lot of very physical conflict or criminalization, or some of the other things Savita was talking about, the steps that companies need to take would need to be a lot more carefully thought through. So, the first thing is to understand what the context is and what the risks are to people who are involved, and particularly Indigenous peoples and local community members who may be vulnerable. Because when a downstream company starts acting, that can generate pressure on the ground. So that's the first thing I think that's really important for companies, downstream companies, to do. The second thing that I would say is critical in determining what to do next is talking to the affected communities themselves. I answered this in response to another question, but I don't think affected communities have the definitive role in deciding what happens, but I think that what they want to happen is pretty important. It's a pretty major consideration for how the company should then go on to act. So, finding out what the situation is and how the community would like the downstream company to respond, I think is important. And in some cases, they will want the company to pull out. And I think where that is the case, I think that's there are other considerations, but in most cases, the company should take that request seriously. But in many cases, the community will want the downstream company to stay and try and use their leverage in some way. So that's, it's not guaranteed that communities will want downstream companies to pull out. So I think talking to the community and seeing what they want and how they would like to try and resolve it is really important. And the other thing is downstream companies can sometimes act in some way as mediators or incentivize the upstream companies to act in a better way. So analysing what your leverage is and what you might be able to offer and how is one way of doing it. And, we know there are instances where some land restitution has been offered to communities and other areas have been kept by companies, and that's been negotiated. So I think these things are not impossible. They're difficult, but they're not impossible. I'll stop there because I'm sure other panelists have some things to add on that as well.
Just a quick point on, sorry, Megan. Okay, right. Just a quick additional point on what Anushka has just said. You always have to remember that you have the power to actually press your suppliers to perform better. And if they're not willing to do that, what you have to do is actually to speak to the legitimate representative of the community and listen to what their demands are, because it's very important, because sometimes their demands are land restitutions and nothing else. They just want their land back. And in that case, you should really just stop your relationship with that company. Thanks.
Thank you. Megan, do you want to come in for a few last words before I wrap this up?
Sure. I was just going to note that I think one of the gaps that we also see with the downstream companies is a reliance on, grievance mechanisms when they're really not at the operational level, and grievance mechanisms that are oftentimes intended more for their own operations around labor rights abuses. And so I think it's really important for downstream companies to also think about how they can build a grievance management process for addressing these types of social issues that are occurring at the production level, really establishing clear timelines establishing steps for when they're going to evaluate the grievances, how they're going to notify and consult the direct suppliers who are implicated, determining what will be an eligible grievance within their system, notifying the complainant and direct suppliers about their decision to take on the grievance, setting up a process where they can investigate the grievance through either working with their direct supplier to hire, for instance, an independent third party, or perhaps in certain circumstances, given the contextual relationships, if there's significant mistrust, if there's violence, but perhaps it's better for the brand, for instance, to invest in hiring their own independent investigator, and then determining the timelines. I think what we see a lot of times with these companies, because they are so far removed, I think their processes to evaluate grievances are especially long. I think for land rights in general, we see that these types of grievances will sit on grievance trackers for quite an extended amount of time with no action and really no correspondence taking place. So I think really having those internal systems in place where there's clear triggers for when you're going to engage with your suppliers, what the roles and responsibilities will be, and then when you do have policy violations, human rights abuses identified, working with suppliers to develop those time-bound action plans, looking at corrective action, what are the types of actions around remediation, and then also looking at systemic change. So looking at how at the group level can we go and try to improve systems and processes so these are not going to be reoccurring in future expansions and future operations, for instance.
Wonderful, thank you. And with that, we are at the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank all the panelists. And just to let you know, here on this slide, you'll see that we've assembled a whole list of resources here for learning more about this topic. We have AFI resources and the materials listed here. It's all hot linked on this presentation, and we'll be sharing both the recording of this webinar as well as the slide deck to all of you. So you'll have links to all of these. And then also you'll see resources that our panelists have shared as well at the bottom here. And if you can go to the next slide. And then also just a pitch for the rest of our training and learning webinar series. We are about to launch a whole new series. And you can see here a bulleted list of some of the main topics that we'll be covering over the next few months to a year. And you can learn all about these as well as listen to recordings from past ones by visiting the AFI website. And so with that, I want to again thank all the participants for joining today, and many, many thanks to all the panelists for your time and for the great perspectives that you shared. And with that, I'll close us off and say goodbye, everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Yeah.